Carry on. 1601?
He was born in 1697. And so he lived 81 years. Where was I going? So, although he wrote his own autobiography, I have not read Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's autobiography, but I have taken certain parts that I've received from others, and I hope that I get it as close as I can to his actual real autobiography. His autobiography was actually translated into English in the last 10 years. So it's something that one can get. It's something that one can get. There is a biography that was written in the 1930s, which has got a lot of the biographer who wrote it took a lot of things from Freud and others to try to understand Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, and really as other historians that have written on the book reviews say, that he's mischaracterized Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's life on that book. So I try to steer away from that book, which is known as Yaakov Emdon and his controversies. So as a child, he was born in Altona, which was then part of Denmark. He was part of the Tri-Cities of Altona, Hamburg, and I can't really pronounce the one, Westhofer, something like that. I'm mispronouncing it, obviously. It's a German name that I'm not so well versed in, but he was born over there in Altona. His father was Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi, so his last name actually would have been Ashkenazi, although everybody knows him as Yaakov Emdon, or the Yabetz, because that's the acronym for his name, Yaakov ben Tzvi, Jacob the son of Tzvi, and that was what he was known on. And as a child, he studied immensely in levels of Torah, and he became quite a scholar even as a young child. And he writes quite a bit about his childhood, about his studying during his childhood and right through. When he was about 16, he had a girl that was in Altona that he liked, and he felt that she had all the character traits and all the positivity, and he writes about this. And his father discouraged him from marrying her due to her not having any good ancestry, due to the sector of the where she had come from in her family lineage, and she felt that that he was from a rabbinic family, and therefore he should marry somebody of a higher stature than this girl. He ended up not long later getting married in the year in 1715. He got married, and when he got married to the daughter of another rabbi. I don't know where it's from, but that marriage sadly did not last. He writes quite strongly in his own autobiography. He writes about the negativities of his. He writes in his own autobiography the negativities of his wife's marriage. The negativities of his wife, the flaws of his wife, and this sort of thing. And it ends up divorced. He ends up later in life getting married 2 more times, and I believe he got divorced. 2 out of 3 he ended up divorced. The last one, he actually married his own niece, which that's the one that didn't. In Jewish law, although one's not allowed to marry their nephew or their aunt, man can't marry the aunt, they can halachically marry a niece. I wouldn't. We don't encourage that because of what can cause. It can cause when people marry within families. It can cause all sorts of negativities on future generations, especially with the DNA genome and so on. It can really cause issues, but it's not against the Jewish law to marry one's niece, but he did later. His third marriage was to his niece. Now,
does this still happen today in religious communities?
Doesn't happen today. I don't know anyone married to their niece. I know people married to cousins, but not to a niece.
And that's acceptable.
To some extent, I'm guessing it's acceptable. I don't. Turn this to silent. I don't know. I think cousins. I mean, it's probably just. I wouldn't.
Their first cousin, but maybe they were just.
But I mean, it does happen. It does happen. I do know people married to their first cousins within the Jewish community. I don't know anyone married to a niece. I don't think we'd encourage in today's knowledge of what can happen from marrying cousins. I don't think it's encouraged in any way or form. It is known within the Jewish community, there's a number of autoimmune issues that stem through the Jewish community because of how much marrying within relatives happened, especially in rabbinic families, where it became very, very common to marry a very close relative, someone who's their cousins. You found that also in the aristocratic Europe as well, where they married a lot within their own relatives and try to keep things in their own families. But that is really off the topic because he did marry his niece later in life, but I don't know the details of how old she was, how old he was, whether they had children together or not. So he in 1728, he gets his first and only rabbinic position. And he was the Rabbi of Emdon for 5 years. That's why he is known as Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, because of that rabbinic position that he had for those 5 years in the town of Emdon. After that, he is not does not get any rabbinic positions, as we are going to probably see in a few minutes, or in the next few minutes, as to why nobody would want to hire someone like Rabbi Yaakov Emdon. So he was a very, very sharp fellow, and he refused to back down in any argument. He took every argument to the grave. And that is literally, he would fight with everybody. He had no problems getting in. If he had a belief about something, he had no problems taking it all the way. Okay, so
that's all that's on Wikipedia about him. Actually, nothing else except that he fought with everybody.
Well, that sort of, I mean, although it doesn't encompass his life, it shows a lot of his life, because that's where he came out to the public. That's where he came into the public life. So after living in Emdon, and he actually became a jeweler for a while and traveled as a traveling jeweler, which was not successful at all. He was a very bad at that job. He didn't make money on it, and he writes in his biography about how difficult it was, and how that it wasn't financially good for him, this becoming a traveling jeweler. And he went into a few other businesses of importing, exporting, and none of these things worked. And so obviously, and it's likely because of his personality of, that, once he had made a decision, once he had come up with something that, there was nothing that was going to change his mind about those things, that probably ended up causing him to have a difficulty. But, I can't say. I'm not in the 18th century. I wouldn't know, but it's likely that is what caused him to have all of that, all of those hardships in his financial in his business life. I mean, he does write quite a bit about his financial life. He only held the position of as a city rabbi in Emdon for 5 years, at which point he became a traveling salesman and eventually moved back to Altona, where he was originally born. When he gets there, he gets into a fight with the chief rabbi at the time, and he argues with a lot of the rabbinic decisions that the rabbi at the town makes. He argues with him. He opens his own synagogue in the town of Altona, in his own home, and it became, first they were upset about it, then later they told him that he's not allowed to train any other synagogue but his own synagogue. As the fights go on back and forth, they decide whether to allow him or not allow him to fight with to pray in the synagogues. He got into a lot of trouble with the different arguments that he had. One of the to show you the extent of how far he was willing to go with his opinion or to go against the norm was he first took on, not sure actually which one's first, but there were two authorship of two very, very well-known Jewish books. One is the Zohar and the other one is the Moreh Nevuchim. And he took on who was the author of these two books. So the Zohar is, for many, many years, it's been said that this comes from the 2nd century Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was considered one of the greatest rabbis in his generation. The Talmud speaks about him as like that he was probably the greatest of the rabbi in the Tanaic era. He was the greatest. I mean, he was a phenomenal individual. He was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva. Actually, this next Thursday, we celebrate the yahrzeit of the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and we actually it became a celebration because he asked that the day of his passing should become a day of celebration, and that became Lag BaOmer. People do bonfires and do a lot of people do archery, and it's an interesting Jewish custom that became Lag BaOmer. Many people who have children that where they have the custom of the Opshonish, they'll do it by Lag BaOmer on the day of the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. An Opshonish is where we don't cut our hair until they're 3 years old, because there's a custom not to cut hair from Passover till Lag BaOmer. So there's 33 days. You have all those children that are within those 33 days that end up having their haircut on the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon, but that's for a different class on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So that's who most people claim, or did till the 17th century, claimed was the author of the Zohar, although it wasn't really spread until the 13th century, which then a Spanish rabbi, skips my mind at the moment what his name was, Moshe, skips my mind what his name was, but he wrote letters saying that he's got these documents that have been passed down for 1100 years, and or passed down, like rewritten, obviously not the original documents, but he's got basically rewritten documents of 1100 years old, which he claimed were from Rabbi Shimon Yochai. And this is probably the book that Kabbalah, most of the Kabbalistic works that we have today, base themselves to the Zohar. They go back to the Zohar. They all quote the Zohar a lot, and it's become probably the head work of the Kabbalah is the book of the Zohar. Whether it's written by the 13th century rabbi, whether it's written by Rabbi Shimon Yochai, it is a great piece of work, and it's there's no question of its greatness and its level of being able to talk about the spiritual realms, going through and bringing people to the spiritual realms. Now, when it comes to Kabbalah, there's people that misused Kabbalah, misuse it, which we will get to in a few minutes. But first, we have to explain. So he was the first one to say that the Zohar was not written by Rabbi Shimon Yochai, but this 13th century rabbi, he wrote it himself, and he attributed it to Rabbi Shimon Yochai. So he claimed it to be forgery. Today, most secular scholars agree with Rabbi Yaakov Emdon and say that it's not that it couldn't have come from Rabbi Shimon Yochai, especially that some of the wording in some of the words in the Zohar are actually Spanish words. It's like as Rabbi Joseph Telushkin puts it, is that you put in it's like looking at ancient Hebrew works and finding the word automobile inside in Hebrew letters in it. So although some traditional rabbis still look at it from, and many of them still attribute it completely to Rabbi Shimon, whether it's just the ideas of Rabbi Shimon that were passed down, but actually only written down in the 13th century or something like that, it's still majority of rabbinic scholars still believe that it's attributed to Rabbi Shimon, although he might not have written it word for word, which is quite obvious from the wording that you have medieval Spanish words in there that fall into the Zohar. But it's whichever way it is, it's still a great piece of work. So he started to say that, and many people today try to claim and discredit the entire Zohar because of Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's words, because of the way he said that it wasn't from Rabbi Shimon Yochai. And today, many people try to say, and they try to be anti-Kabbalah entirely. I don't know if Rabbi Yaakov Emdon was completely against Kabbalah. There's no question that he studied Kabbalah. He does talk about his study of Kabbalah, and he did learn these things, so he had a good understanding of them. But then these people were going to say that he studied it in order to be able to argue its, in their opinion, its falseness and that sort of thing, and that became a thing. The other book that he argued the authenticity of it was the Moreh Nevuchim. Maimonides lived in the 11th century, I believe, and he was born in Spain, ended up in Morocco, then Israel, and then Palestine was known then, and then in Egypt, where he was a doctor who became the royal physician of the King of England, Egypt, and but he wrote a phenomenal amount of books. The most famous is the Mishnah Torah, which he wrote a full halachic works of going through all Jewish law. And the next most famous book that he wrote is known as the Moreh Nevuchim. Moreh Nevuchim is the guide for the perplexed. Perplexed.
It's everywhere.
So he wrote a book on philosophy called Moreh Nevuchim. And Rabbi Yaakov Emdon said that there's no way that somebody could write the halachic works in one way and then write a philosophy book in a totally different way that argues with, that sort of, if you look at it on a thing, that it argues with itself. Now, if you look at it from a person, one is talking to a group who want to know, what should I do in a day-to-day life, which is the Mishnah Torah. You want to know what is Jewish law? What does Jewish law say in this situation? And then it brings in a little bit of philosophy, but it's taking someone from that perspective of Jewish law. The Moreh Nevuchim is not going through to somebody and saying, should you keep Jewish law? Should you not keep Jewish law? It's saying to somebody who's unsure of belief, doesn't know what to believe, where to believe, and goes through and takes the world from that perspective and brings down how a person should come to their beliefs in life based on a worldly perspective rather than from a more worldly perspective than a specifically a religious perspective, although it brings religion in, but it's a strong book. So Yaakov Emdon said that they contradict each other so strongly that there's no way that the same person could have written both books. And therefore, he said that the Moreh Nevuchim couldn't have been from Maimonides. That claim has nobody today would agrees with Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, or as far as I know, shouldn't say nobody, but in general, religious scholars, non-religious scholars, historians, they all agree that the Moreh Nevuchim was written by the Maimonides, and that he wrote it, and more that he wrote it because he was writing it to a different sort of group, so therefore it comes out in things that do contradict with his main work, which was the book on Jewish law. So he took on those two things, and that just shows you how strongly he felt that he was able to comment in different areas, and he had, obviously, although he didn't have a rabbinic position in any single location or any place, he still had a very strong ability to connect, to have many people writing letters with questions and responsa. So he was very, very well spoken, and he spoke to many, many people in many different situations. He brought out all these different situations. He would answer these questions. So he was quite well known, and he was very accepted in his rabbinic stature, although he never got another position as rabbi of a city, probably due to his harsh personality and due to his uncompromising and not being able to work with anyone. To understand how rabbis were hired in those days, you had each city had the members of the city that would run the city, sort of thing. They would be in charge of the Gemeinde. In Germany, it was called Gemeinde, which is the community. You had these individuals, and then they would have different volunteers, which would be, you had the volunteer service for the Chevra Kadisha, those who take care of the people who passed away, and you had a volunteer service for Gomlei Chasadim, which would be the Chevra Gomlei Chasadim, those that would help with the charities, and then you have the Chevra Shas, those that would help with encouraging learning within the community. So you had all these different groups underneath, and this sort of a council would hire a rabbi for the city. And although the rabbi had a little bit of a say over those people, he would have a position and be able to say, this is this, but ultimately he was hired by them and they could fire him. So he had to choose which things he would do. But somebody like Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, who had his path straightforward and wouldn't deviate from his opinion, and wouldn't give in any sort of manner, any sort of amount, couldn't get a position. So after a number of years in the jewelry business and in the import and export business, he got permission from the king of Denmark to open a printing press. Printing press. And as the position of rabbi, not in any community, but as a position of a rabbi writing books, having his own printing press, he was very successful, finally, because he could print as many books as he wants on his own, all his own writings and all his own things, and he could spread them and sell them throughout, and people are going to buy from, he's a great rabbi. Maybe they would, maybe they would bring him out to speak, but he didn't have a job in a rabbinic position. Now, this caused a lot of controversy, because usually a rabbi had to deal with a community, so they weren't able to be very controversial. But being that he didn't have a community, he could be as controversial as he wanted to be, and he can go all the way controversial to the extent that he was of the opinion that we should bring concubines back into Judaism. And he writes extensively on trying to bring, that although there was the Xero made by Rabbi Gershom against having more than one wife, he was of the opinion that there's so many women that have no one to marry, and if we allow concubines back into Judaism, these women will at least have someone to protect them and that sort of thing. And obviously, he was in that area. He was not accepted by people, and that was not. But he didn't care what people think about him in any way or form, and that's why he was able to make such sort of claims and those sort of push those sort of things. So the most famous thing that Rabbi Yaakov Emdon is known for is his war against Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz was a rabbi that originally came from Eastern Europe. He had worked up his way, his ranks. He got his smicha at the age of 15, so he became a rabbi. He was a genius of his time. He was phenomenal. He knew the entire Shas at the age of 13. So he knew the entire Talmud, and he was also had a very, very great wit to him. And so Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz had moved his way through the rabbinical ranks, starting off in Prague and then in Minsk, and eventually he became the rabbi of the three cities of Hamburg, Altona, and the last one was where Rabbi Yaakov Emdon lived. Now, during that time, or just before Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz and Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, there was a person named Shabtai Tzvi, who came from Turkey, Constantinople, and he claimed to be the Messiah. And he got a very, very big following. It was right after the Chmielnicki massacres in Eastern Europe, and that's when thousands, the Cossacks went through towns just killing Jewish people in their war against the Polish aristocrats. They went after the Jews, and they killed thousands and thousands of Jews. Estimates are somewhere in the within 2 years they killed about 50,000 Jews. 50 to 60,000 in these towns. They wiped out a bunch of towns in mainly in Ukraine, what's today Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, that area, which was then part of Poland. Though at that point it was considered part of the Polish Empire. It was like Poland was quite big at that time. This was 100 years before Yaakov Emdon that we're talking about today. But after that, there was a man named Shabtai Tzvi, and he claimed to be the Messiah. And he used Kabbalah to do miracles and to do all sorts of things. And he had a very, very big backing. And eventually, the Sultan of Turkey, or of the Ottoman Empire, I should say, the Ottoman Empire, got scared, and he brought him in. He reined him in, and he said to him that either you convert to Islam or we're going to kill you. And Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam. At that point, most of the rabbis that had followed Shabtai Tzvi jumped ship, and they said, no, he's not someone who's the Messiah is not going to.
But where did the Christians fit in with that? Because
he was in down because the word spread.
So
he went around the world. He went and he traveled the world telling everyone he's the Messiah.
He's self-proclaimed.
Self-proclaimed, and he had lots of students, and he had lots of. And because things were so bad in Eastern Europe at the time, right after the Chmelnytsky riots, they were willing to take on anything, and there were thousands and thousands of Jews that sold their homes ready to move to Jerusalem because Messiah.
And did the Christian world support him, or was he just?
No, it was more in the Jewish world. Right. But the second he converted to Islam, majority of the rabbis jumped ship. Although there were many people that were so stooped into it and so into his thing that they created a new religion called the Sabbateans. And they were like supporters of Shabtai Tzvi, and they made their own thing. You know, even after he died, they claimed that he was going to be resurrected. There was a guy named Frank who lived in the Ukraine, who, what was his first name? Avram Frank, I can't remember his first name, who started the Frankistan movement, and he claimed that he was the reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi. Actually, Rabbi Yaakov Emdon actually wrote letters to counteract the Frankistan movement when it came through. So the Arba Aratzos, the Jewish Council of the Polish Empire, were very against this Frank. And they used actually Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's writings to fight against the Frankism as they were rising. But at that point, there became a very, very superstitious thing where any person that started to talk about Kabbalah or anything like that, they would say, "Oh, he's a Sabbatean, he's a closet Sabbatean." So he's one of these Shabtai Tzvi supporters. So long beforehand, in 1725, there was a guy that was traveling from Turkey with a bunch of documents, and he was in Frankfurt, and they got suspicious of him, and they raided his hotel room, and they found a lot of Sabbatean documents in his room. And one of those documents was claimed to be from Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. Whether it was from him, who knows? It's not known. But because of that, the Beth Din in Amsterdam made a excommunication of Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, which wasn't really accepted anywhere else. That excommunication, because he was a prominent rabbi at that time. Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz went on Erev Yom Kippur with his community, and he cursed out. He placed a curse with his community with God's name on Erev Yom Kippur, that anyone who is a Sabbatean should be cursed by God, and gave a full curse with his whole community. And this was his way of saying, I've got nothing to do with these Sabbateans. And I'm putting a curse onto myself. Because if I'm a closet Sabbatean, then I'm putting a curse on myself. And this was to come and say, so that people shouldn't say Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz is a Sabbatean. Now, 20 years later, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz gets appointed. So he moves through the ranks of the rabbinics, starting off in Prague, where he was actually quite high up, but then he got kicked out by the government there because of some anti-Christian comments that he had made, and he ended up moving to Minsk, and then eventually he was eventually he's appointed the rabbi of Hamburg and Altona. So this is where Yaakov Emdon is. And remembering that Yaakov Emdon had a fight with the rabbi before him because he wanted, and also he had tried to get the position of, which was his father's position. His father was the chief rabbi of so here Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz gets this position. He thought that finally he's got himself a secure position, and Yaakov Emdon starts the war against him. He had some women ask for amulets, or some women who were pregnant had gotten amulets from Yonasan Eibshitz, and Rabbi Yaakov Emdon looked at the amulets and he tried to claim that they had Sabbatean origins, that they were from the Sabbateans, and therefore Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz was a closet Sabbatean, and he's got to be kicked out. And this gets the community had just hired him, and there's a thing, and the community really, really supported Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. Yaakov Emdon writes a letter to the heads of the Vad Arba Rotzos, the heads of the community in Poland, because there was a very, very strong Jewish leadership in Poland at the time. Because it was a very strong. They had like an autonomous government under the Polish government, and he applied to them to have Rabbi Yonasan, them to excommunicate Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, and they refused. So even though he had helped them 10 years earlier against the Frank system, they said there's nothing here. It's you can't prove these amulets come from Yonasan Eibshitz. Who knows that? And you're claiming he's a closet Sabbatean. So he's like not. So Yaakov Emdon doesn't end there. He's getting the fight going on, and he's doing it, and it becomes dangerous on the street, and Rabbi Yaakov Emdon has to escape. He escapes, I believe, to Amsterdam because things get really bad. At that point, the city council of Hamburg supported Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, and everything was okay in Hamburg, but the problem was Altona was under the Danish government. And being Altona was under the Danish government, the Danish didn't agree so quickly. They heard about the fighting that's going on in the street within the Jewish community, and the king of the Danish king requests that from Yonasan Eibshitz what's going on. So he wants to know what's this whole fight, and the king they have a court case, and the king resides over the court case. And in the court case, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz had actually a former student of his who had converted to Christianity. He had a former student of his who converted to Christianity, who was was a professor of Hebrew studies in Bulgaria. Bulgaria, I think it is. I'm not sure the city. I could check it up. Afterwards. And in this. This individual fights his case, and it seems that he won because, or the king basically, well, he sort of won. He won that the king said that there's no charges against Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. He didn't do anything wrong. He requests that they allow Yaakov Emdon back to Altona. Rabbi Yaakov Emdon gets protection. And and there's a re-election for the rabbi who's going to be the chief rabbi of Altona, Hamburg, and Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz wins by a vast majority in the election, and he thinks now that he's secure because he just won the election. But the council in Hamburg changed over, and the new council starts to support. The non-Jewish council starts to support Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's side. So now, although he's secure in Altona, he's not secure in Hamburg because they're part of the same city, but they're different countries. So it becomes complicated, and there's letters going back and forth, and it's quite a war. There was a rabbi who later became the chief rabbi of Prague, known as the Noda Yehuda, Rabbi Chester Landau. He was a very, very renowned rabbi. Wrote the book called the Noda Yehuda, and he tried to make peace between Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz and Yaakov Emdon. And he wrote that in a manner where he said, Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, that we can't prove that these amulets were actually written by Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz. So although they have the Sabbatean things in them, we can't say that Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz wrote them. So therefore, we have to give him the benefit of the doubt. And at the same time, he said, even if these amulets were written by him, they're not hereditary in nature, because the people might have been wearing them, but he's not trying to push them to go towards Sabbatean ways through these amulets, because they can't. The people wearing them don't understand what's on the amulets. They have no clue. They're just wearing them because it makes them feel good. So, and he tried to make this reconcile. Yaakov Emdon wouldn't hear anything of it. He would not hear any of it, and he's like, no, he's a closet Sabbatean, and there's nothing to hear. And the war goes on. He's printing after printing against it, trying to get rabbis to support him throughout. Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz tries to get supporters. One of the big rabbis that supported Rabbi Yaakov Emdon was known as the Pnei Yeshua, who did support Rabbi Yaakov Emdon. Majority of the other rabbis at that time supported Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz, and it was full-out war between the two. And it really, as I mentioned, it got into the non-Jewish community, and all of this about the fight over Jewish mysticism went right through the non-Jewish circles, and quite a bit was written in non-Jewish circles of their perception of this battle that was happening amongst the Jews. Now, this caused, although the Shabtai Tzvi caused a disheartening of people with their respect for rabbinic structure, this war between Rabbi Yaakov Emdon and Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz really destroyed that back, and many people lost their support for rabbinic structure, and that opened the way for many of the Jewish people when the French Revolution happened, and further, where they really turned away from rabbinic Judaism and turned into more the Haskalah, or the Enlightenment, and so on. Before I go into Yaakov Emdon's connection with the Enlightenment, I'm going to first mention that in 1760, so 9 years after this war begins, Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz's son, Wolf, actually comes out and says that he's a Sabbatean prophet. So this showed, Yaakov Emdon used this and said, see, I was right the whole time. He was, look, even his son became a Sabbatean prophet. This caused a lot of trouble for Yonason Eibschitz. He had a yeshiva that he was learning, and now had to close down at that point because nobody wanted to send his yeshiva, because although they still respected him, they were a little bit more skeptical because his son had become a Sabbatean. The actual fight ended where Rabbi Yaakov Emdon actually continued spewing this negativity on Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz even after Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz passed away in 1764 for the last 3 years of his life, and he went, although they are buried pretty much just about next to each other in the cemetery. But not long after Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's passing, the Vilna Gaon, who was probably one of the most respected rabbis in the generation right after Yaakov Emdon and Yonason Eibschitz, he he put it to rest, and he supported Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz's side, and pretty much Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz ends up winning the war amongst the religious in Judaism, and it's now accepted that he was not probably not sabbatean in any sort of manner or form. There's no evidence to it, although these recent scholars have looked through the amulets and do show different references that might be considered sabbatean, but that's not from a historical. That's more from a philosophical discussion, and I'm not really going to be able to talk on that topic. Just to one more area that I wanted to mention was Reb Moses Mendelssohn was he is the first rabbi of the Reform movement. So he considered himself a student of Rabbi Yaakov Emdon. There's quite a bit of correspondence between them, and there's quite a bit that went back and forth between them of correspondence. Moses Mendelssohn actually went to Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz to ask for his rabbinic ordination, and he, being a great scholar in both the rabbinic studies as well as in German and philosophy and other areas, they felt he was scared to give him the actual smicha, so he just gave him a resounding letter of recommendation, which basically said that what a great scholar he is, and talked about how great this Moses Mendelssohn was, but he wouldn't give him the smicha. And instead, so it ended up that he ended up becoming closer to Rabbi Yaakov Emdon. He claimed to be a follower of Rabbi Yaakov Emdon. Rabbi Yaakov Emdon actually did have one argument with Moses Mendelssohn, and that argument was over. There was at that point there were some people that were buried when they were still alive, where people had died, and obviously the doctors had misdiagnosed death, and then they would wake up during their funerals and things like that. It became a few times. So the governor of the area said that he wanted that people should wait 3 days before burial. So that way, if the person's alive, they should. If the person's alive, they should. So Rabbi Yaakov Emdon was asked about that, and he sent a letter to Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn asking him to deal with this and to try to fix it. Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn, seeing the situation, he's like, well, we should have buried alive people, so we have to wait 3 days. Yaakov Emdon was very upset about that, and he's like, no, we just have to make sure that the people are actually dead.
It's supposed to be buried on the same day.
Yeah, in Judaism, we bury them within a day. We try to bury on the same day. We try to bury as quickly as possible. So but we have to make sure that they are dead, and we have to do the right, and there's enough medical knowledge of how to do the right testing to make sure that somebody's actually passed away before. And this was where Rabbi Yaakov Emdon had a argument with Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn. That is pretty much the life in short of Rabbi Yaakov Emdon, a phenomenal individual who, as I said, wouldn't allow anyone to change his opinion about anything. Would sum up a lot of who he was, but also, there's no question of his geniusness. He actually learned German and Danish and Latin as well. He also studied. Although he didn't study properly in a university, but he studied medicine. He read a lot of medical books and had a lot of correspondence with doctors about different medical things because of his interest in medicine, although he never actually became a doctor. So that is in short Rabbi Yaakov Emdon's life. Today, as I said, he's sadly because of his fight with Rabbi Yonatan Eibschitz, he's not as well respected as he probably should have been. Although with his level of argumentativeness and that, maybe that's probably why he doesn't get the awe that he probably should, because he was a genius that you don't get very often, but also was uncompromising in his opinion. So with that, I'll conclude. And thank you for those that joined on the Zoom. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to ask.